I'm very excited today to have a special guest with us, Mickie Kennedy. Mickie is the founder and president of eReleases, the small business leader for press release distribution, now celebrating 23 years in business. He's an expert at helping small businesses increase their visibility and credibility. eReleases distributes press releases to 550 new news content systems, 3,000 newsrooms, and more than 4,500 major news sites through PR Newswires network. And their media database exceeds 1.7 million contacts, including more than 700,000 bloggers and social media influencers. Mickie, welcome to the Go for Launch podcast.
Thanks, Brandon. Glad to be here.
You look like you're in a comfortable environment. For anyone watching this on YouTube, I always ask, where are you in the world today besides your living room?
I am in Baltimore County, Maryland.
All right, Baltimore, the home of eReleases. So we're going to have some fun conversation because my background, I actually started in PR many decades ago as well. So that was one of my first and long-lasting loves is public relations. So we'll talk about what that is and specifically what the press release is all about. And speaking of that, that is my first question. So a lot of people call it the press release. I like to call it the media release or the news release because obviously the word press is very print-centric and sounds kind of old-fashioned, but it's been here for a long time. So Mickie, can you tell us roughly when the news release or the press release format as we know it came into existence?
I think it was in like the 1950s. There was I think a train derailment, and the train company thought that they needed to inform the media, so they put together what they thought was the information and then sent it along. And that sort of started people saying, wow, this is really unique. This was very useful. And it would be nice if more companies would send us, these data sheets whenever something like a breaking news story or something happened. And it sort of grew from there. With companies, mostly publicly traded companies, issuing their news over newswires, which sort of disseminated this stuff into newsrooms across the country.
Okay, so we'll get to that whole concept of the newswire, which
Sure.
I assume came long after that 1950 incident. Well, it's just interesting that basically started with some crisis. Who knew?
Right. And I think it was like in the 1960s when the newswire began. It's one of those things that a company wants to just delegate, larger companies. Having to figure out how to reach all of the journalists quickly. You didn't have email. You didn't have the ability to send something through the internet. So they were looking for feed systems that could do that. And so that's where the newswire stepped in.
Okay, that's really interesting. I never actually thought of it because I remember back when I was in college in the Stone Ages, I worked at this radio station, and one of my major jobs was being a news reader. And I used to have to go into this room where there was this giant box. It was kind of like a pre-fax machine, I guess, which was the AP Newswire. And these big sheets of paper would, and they'd spit out the news. So I imagine it was that kind of like the original press release newswires were something similar.
It was. A lot of that was disseminated either over telephone wires or satellite feeds directly into newsrooms across the country. And it was antiquated, but it was the only way to quickly do it, pre-internet.
Yeah, so when the internet came along, all of a sudden we magically were able to start using these things called online newswires. So tell us a little bit about that evolution and the fact that you guys are aligned with one of I think the oldest, which is PR Newswire.
Correct. Yeah. So when the internet came along, it made things a lot easier. You no longer had to rely on satellite broadcasts, which are expensive. And so most of the newswires transitioned to using the internet. And a lot of journalists are no longer accessing the content in the newsroom on their terminals because it used to be a closed intranet system. And so they've made it so that all the newswires, a journalist can just log in through a username and password. It's not tied to their news outlet any longer. And they can look at the feeds that interest them, usually by vertical or geographical, sometimes a mixture of both. And they can also do some targeting, like some searches and stuff like that. So exclude everything that mentions, if I cover fashion ready to wear. It doesn't interest me. I'm in, high fashion. So you can set up some exclusions and inclusions so that you're looking at more relevant content as a journalist.
Got it. So, I've been writing press releases since the late 80s, gonna go ahead and just date myself there, right? But I actually think the format of the press release, which according to you kind of dates back to 1950 roughly, I think the format of it is pretty easy to follow. Typically there's a headline, there might be a subhead, then there's what's called a dateline, which is, the city where the press release is coming from, the actual date, and then, a hyphen, and followed by the body copy of the release, which we'll talk about. And then generally there's what's called a boilerplate, which is a couple paragraphs about the company issuing the press release. The standard Coca-Cola is, founded in 1909 as XYZ, this stuff that gets copied and pasted in pretty much any release. So the format, I tell people, is pretty simple, but I always say, unless you know what you're doing when you're writing one, it's not as simple as it looks. Do you agree with that, Mickie?
I agree that a press release is, if it's done right, should look simple. I think a lot of the strategy that goes into what should be in the press release is where people get tripped up.
Right.
It's the strategy before the press release is even written is largely 80-20 going to decide whether the press release gets any attention. And so few people don't understand that. But when you look at a release that was developed strategically as opposed to a release that was just, not, they're written the same. But one is going to be more engaging to the media and interest them because that person thought, what is it that readers and viewers ultimately want to know in this news? And so I've positioned it so that I'm getting that across and it's more relevant. It might, some people call it a hook, some people call it, lots of different things, but it has that sizzle, that compellingness to it, that newsworthiness to it, that a lot of times happens before it's written.
Right. And a lot of people overlook two major things. And I know you see this every day because this is your business. But number one, they don't think about how is this applicable to the local journalist that's going to look at this. In other words, you could have some catastrophe happening in Baltimore, Maryland today, and I guarantee you that no one in Charlotte probably cares about it unless it hits a certain level, right?
Sure.
Or you're a manufacturer and you've come up with something amazing in Baltimore that is going to be impactful for people across the U.S. and possibly the globe. So number one is thinking locally. Even if it's something that you're distributing all over, how is that going to impact somebody in Topeka, Kansas versus Charlotte, North Carolina or whatever? And then number two is, like you said, Mickie, not thinking like a journalist. How does this benefit the reader? How does this benefit the viewer? If this is a person in television looking at a release and thinking, how am I going to visually portray this news or whatever? So what are some of the other common pitfalls you see companies, other than just not being able to write like a journalist? Right. And maybe you speak to that a little bit too. The nuances of a release are they're not flowery and they're not ads.
Right, absolutely. So I think the most common mistakes that I see are headlines. A lot of people feel like it has to be clever, punny, like the New York Post always has really clever headlines. The journalist is looking in their newsroom at just feeds of headlines, and if there's no context in your headline, and it just is clever or funny, very few of them are going to click through to it. They're not going to play that game. They're all about they want to get to shortlist as much as they can, as quickly as they can. Another big mistake that I see is the quote in a press release. Generally, the quotes are very mediocre. And a lot of times what saves a small company being included in an article is having a really compelling quote, something that can't be easily paraphrased. I've seen a lot of my clients come up with a really interesting idea for a press release, send it out, and then an article gets published somewhere that was obviously inspired by the press release, and the company's not mentioned anywhere. And what generally happens is the journalist included the company, but the managing editor looks at this article and says, this is a great article, but why are they mentioning this tiny little company that I've never heard of? And this is a weak quote. So they just slash through that and send it back to them. And that happens a lot. So you want to make it the quote so interesting and compelling that to remove it from an article the article would suffer. There would be a loss.
Well, aside from working with you guys and your great team at eReleases, how do you vet your own, stuff. You're doing your own dog food, if you will, because it really is hard when you're the PR person. Believe me, you're working with people, and of course they're paying you to write this. Typically, they're your client. They say, I want it to say this. And,
Right.
you have to coach them. No, that's boring. That's too technical. It's not interesting, et cetera. So we're trying to massage it, but we're also trying to second guess, how is this going to play to the journalist? What advice do you give people to, come up with multiple quotes and run them by people, or how should they go about that process?
Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we just have to accept that certain places are not good at putting their neck out, and they're not going to be contrarian. They're not going to say something that could be that's a little too aggressive or assertive. So, a lot of press releases get written by committee and then sent over, and you can tell that. And there's a real loss there. We sometimes will make suggestions to punch it up a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's the client, it's their money. All we can do is give them best practices and tell them, based on our experience, we don't think this is as strong as it could be. And if they say, thank you very much for the suggestion, but let's go with it as is, we just send it out. Unfortunately, a lot of people are doing a job where they have certain things they have to do, and once it's gone through all the approvals, making changes to a press release is just systemically so difficult that it will delay the release getting out, and they might get in trouble or something like that. So it's disappointing, but it does happen, and all we can do is just sort of provide guidance and help them to understand that maybe on their next release they'll take something into account that we said.
Yeah. Oh man. In the press release writing process, back and forth can be arduous and, bone crushing for the people in the PR profession. So, I've been there, done that. And, I've seen all kinds of ridiculous, last minute requests or quibbling over, hey, the president should be capitalized. I'm like, no, it isn't. Like, hey, here's AP style book, dude. Like, this is the way it's supposed to be. I can tell you the journalist is going to scoff if he sees it this way. Anyway, lots of quibbling over grammatical nuances and so forth.
One of the interesting things is that when I started back in the 90s, AP style was important. AP style is no longer important. The Newswire doesn't correct it anymore.
Okay.
Used to, if we sent over a release, they would try to educate us and say, hey, Mickie, you run a press release company. You keep making these mistakes and you're not conforming to AP style. I'm like, okay, and I'll talk to the editor who worked on it and we'll try and solve it. But now they don't care. You can send a headline that's all caps and not title case, and they're just going to leave it as is. And part of me, misses the adherence to rules, but then part of me is also like, well, it's great that people aren't caring so much about the particulars, and because you made a stylistic mistake, your press release is probably not going to suffer because the journalists are probably just looking at the content and the core of it. You still don't want obvious grammatical errors or spelling errors, but some of the style stuff just doesn't matter as much as it used to.
Interesting. Well, that's good to know so that people can get a little bit of a pass. Although, like you, I'm kind of a purist at heart. Kind of like, hey, this is the way it's been done for a long time, since the 50s maybe, and so don't go too crazy here, right? Don't write haiku or be E.E. Cummings with all your lowercase or whatever you think is being clever, because that will get probably a couple eyeballs raised going, this is ridiculous. But so let me ask you this: why are press releases to this day so valuable, do you think? In other words, what are some of the benefits of sending press releases?
Well, if you're looking for a really good hit rate, I always tell people, if you reach out to journalists directly, ideally ones you have a relationship with, your hit rate's going to be really strong. For local media, anyone who contacts eReleases, any editor will say, you don't want to use us. There's less than 12 people in your local area that will write about you. Think about it. It's like a newspaper, maybe if you have a secondary or minor paper, a business paper, if you're lucky enough to have one of those, 2 or 3 radio stations that might have programs that profile businesses or talk about business or interview business owners, and maybe a couple of TV. So you're really, most people, it's like 6 to 8 people that you need to find. And you can get their email address by just asking and calling. Some people aren't great at that, but there's websites online that'll help you find an email address. I think hunter.io and a lot of these other ones where if you're trying to find someone, they're pretty good at it. And there's no cost if it's just a handful of media, email contacts that you're searching for. And I always say, now that you have your 6 or 8 core people, introduce yourself and occasionally send them content. And if something really interesting is happening in your industry and your local paper is not reporting about it, send them the tip, and you'll become an asset to them. And when you do have a story that you feel the local media should be receptive to, they're going to be much more likely because you're going to know you're on their radar. So 4 to 8 emails to each year would be my goal for that. But that's the downside of that method is it's labor intensive, and you really can't do that with your entire industry or newspapers nationwide. And that's where the press release is so valuable. If we have a very newsworthy press release, it could literally get picked up by 200 or 300 small papers across the country. It could appear in several magazines and trade publications. And there's no way you could facilitate several hundred relationships and get your content to them easily. So that's the real power of it. It's sort of democratizes the news and makes it available to you. And sometimes it's not the hardcore breaking news that's going to get picked up by hundreds of places, but you're sending out what you feel is a pretty good press release, and you might get picked up in 4 to 8 places. And again, the value of that, the hundreds or thousands of eyeballs and potential visitors and customers that happens as a result of that is really great. Not even mentioning the SEO benefits of having an article written about you, whether there are links in the press release or not. Google conveys SEO benefit even when there's no link to your website.
Got it. Yeah, and the other key that I've told people, throughout my career is that press releases lend themselves to what I call third-party credibility. Unlike an ad, where when you see an advertisement in a print publication or on TV or wherever, that's an ad. It's very obvious. But if somebody's reading a story in a newspaper or an online blog or watching a television report on some subject, and the company or individual is mentioned, they're a source. They're a credible source. But that third party, the media, is sort of bestowing upon you a little bit of magic dust, if you will. So I think, to me, that is the ultimate goal of the press release, is to help facilitate you becoming a noteworthy, quotable source for information.
Right. Yeah, the credibility factor is important, because the visitors that do come seek you out, they want to do business with you. They never open another window and say, can I find it cheaper on Amazon? Can I find it somewhere else? They want to do business with the company that was mentioned in the article. So you don't have them price shopping. They're a much more loyal customer. They tend to have a more of an emotional bond, reading about a company and then doing business with it. That reminds me of a local carpet company in New Jersey that came to us once and said, we have a budget for PR. And I said, I don't think we can help you. But they said, well, we've got a budget. So we did like a monthly release for them every month. And 5 months in, nothing had happened. And so I had a call with them and said, it's not going well. I kind of warned you. They said, well, we had a budget. And so we were talking, and it turns out that their enemy is Home Depot and Lowe's. And I'm like, I think we can work with this. Let's talk about you marketing as a local carpet company against Home Depot and Lowe's. Well, they got picked up in, I think, 9 or 10 floor trade publications. I never knew that many existed. I thought there's probably 2 or 3 out there. One of the publications offered them a marketing column. They said that they got more positive feedback from that one article that they did based on the press release than they've gotten in over a year combined of everything else.
Wow.
They said that, and it turned out there's a vacuum in the floor trade industry where the readers are very interested in marketing, but no one's talking about it. So, those are the types of strategy things that I always tell clients to do an audit of their industry, find out what they're talking about. There might be an opportunity there, and also find out what they're not talking about. Sometimes there's an opportunity, sometimes there's not. When it comes to cybersecurity, one of my clients knew exactly what they're not talking about and sent a release, and he got phone calls saying, you better shut your mouth and take that down. We don't want people to know how fragile cybersecurity is for e-commerce, and that's what his press release was about. He was saying, I can hack AWS in minutes. I can do this vulnerability, that vulnerability. It's not safe. And he got calls from people saying this isn't good messaging. It's damaging to the industry. And so he learned there's a reason they're not talking about that. And
wow.
So, but you never know. And getting back to the press release, that strategy aspect really is the most important, because sometimes if people are talking about a particular subject, is there a different avenue or different take on it that they don't know? Being contrarian, where you say something that everybody else isn't saying, can be very, very good. I mean, you might come across as the crazy uncle in the industry, but if it's a great way to get picked up, because journalists like to be fair and balanced and have both viewpoints. But there's never the other side for a lot of things within an industry. So if you're willing to put your neck out there and say, this merger is bad for the industry and here's why, you'll be a great counterpoint to all the companies that are saying this is going to create more synergy and lower costs for consumers and things like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The contrarian view is always popular with journalists. Like example for me recently is this Clubhouse app, which everybody's just fawning all over, and I call it the herd mentality, HEARD. Anybody listening, that's my shtick. So, it's like everybody's just rushing to the next bandwagon. Anyway, so you hit on something, though, with that case study of the New Jersey carpet company that I thought was interesting, which was that they came and said, we've got a budget and we're going to do X number of press releases come hell or high water, basically.
Right.
And they weren't too concerned about the outcome, it sounded like. But a lot of companies are opposite. They think, man, if I spend $400 on a press release, I better get covered in the New York Times. So, one of the first things I do with people is time out. Let's have some expectation setting here. A press release is not a magic bullet. It is not going to get you on CNN necessarily or New York Times or whatever. There's the chance, but realistically speaking, and Mickie, what would you say to people? Hey, temper your enthusiasm going in. One press release, first of all, may not do it. It may take several. In fact, I saw a video where you recommend people think about planning for at least 6, right?
Right.
I'd love to
usually
know why that's the magic number or a good benchmark. But then just talk about that expectation setting that you have with clients so that they don't come back and go, well, damn, I spent $1,000. I don't feel like I got anything.
Right. Well, I do try to explain to people that PR works for some companies and doesn't work for others. And really the only way is to do a PR campaign. And that's usually different hooks and angles and different approaches so that you can say, hey, for this company, we tried this approach, we tried this approach. We basically did a 360 walk around their industry, and every avenue that we saw that was available, we took it. And generally, I think that takes at least 6 releases. Sometimes it can take more, unless you can just brainstorm more great ideas. So that's why I always say you really don't know until you try it and get that out there. That being said, there are a lot of people, especially the marketing people, who have ROI and spend, and they want to know their conversion rates and things like that. And PR doesn't necessarily easily translate into that. So you have to sort of, put some money aside, give it a test, see how it does, take what didn't work into account and then try something different. And sometimes it's like pivoting the idea. Sometimes it's just trying a completely different approach from something else that you took account of when you did your your audit of the industry, and you once you've done several of them, you have an understanding of. We didn't get any coverage with this third release, but we did get 5 or 6 people who emailed us and asked for more information, and we're interested in exploring the idea a little bit. Didn't result in an article, but it told me there's something there, and maybe if we explored the idea we did for number 3 and did it slightly different, maybe we could find something that would be a little bit more compelling.
Right. So one of the sticking points for PR people and their clients is what's known as placements. Like if I send this press release out, where's it going to get placed? Right. And that's the PR people are always sweating. So the good news, there's sort of a good and bad news, I'd say, about using any newswire service is that you're going to get placements, right? But some of them are sort of what I call phantom placements, because you send these out and it's going to hit Google News and it's going to hit a bunch of online repositories, right? So I can turn around to the client and say, look, this report, your press release is gone and it's on Yahoo News and it's on all these places. And they're like, yeah, but has anybody actually read that? So there's a difference between some of those initial placements and actual journalists, human breathing humans that write about stuff or cover stuff, seeing that press release and then ultimately going, this sounds interesting, and doing a story that then will end up in a trade publication or whatever. And I really want to quickly share a case study that worked great for me when I had a client a couple years ago. We used eReleases. I think we did 3 press releases, right? And this was an air conditioning company that like doesn't even manufacture anything. They make like these, their process is to construct or architect these super high-end systems for wealthy homeowners essentially. And so it was hard enough to write something interesting. And I remember going back and forth with one of your folks. I think her name was Pearl. She's probably still there, right? I don't know if Pearl still works with you or not.
Yeah, Pearl left.
She was awesome.
She wanted to go in PR herself,
and
not just the press release. So but we're still in touch with her, and she's great.
Yeah, so she, as anybody on your team, that's one of the cool things I think about eReleases. It's very familiar. It's like I feel like it's like the Dunder Mifflin of public relations, because I'm talking to you, Michael Scott, or somebody else in there, like. Maybe not Dwight Schrute, but you know what I'm saying? Like it seems small enough where you get a lot of good attention. Anyway, she helped me sort of work through. Bottom line is they got a lot of these online placements, but nothing really, to write home about, if you will. But here's the cool thing. 2 years later, literally, they got an inquiry through one of the press releases. So I get an email from you guys saying, hey, congratulations, you got an inquiry from a journalist. It was an editor-in-chief of one of the top publications serving the AC industry. Wanted to talk to that client. They were no longer even a client of mine, but how cool was it for me to say, hey guys, you remember that work you paid me for that you were bitching about? Like, this is the payoff. So that's one of the things I tell people too. Again, it's not an immediate silver bullet, but especially if you're doing a bunch of these over time, it can really lay the groundwork. And I want people to understand that, because it's like developing relationships, like you said, even at the local level, which you can do on your own. But when you try to scale it, like you said, you can't keep up with all these people. But for the fact that this one individual went and did a keyword search in the database, and lo and behold, this 2-year-old press release pops up and he goes, oh, these are the experts I need to talk to for the story I'm working on. That was an awesome case study for me.
Yeah, we had a lot of clients who did releases years ago on biometrics and AI, and they didn't do very well because there wasn't a lot of publications writing about it at the time. But I've been contacted by them saying we need to do more releases. I'm getting contacted based off the old releases because they're going to the Newswire and there's an archive there, and they'll do a search for biometrics or artificial intelligence in a particular industry, and these people will pop up, and they'll seek them out because they're looking for experts who can write, talk to them, explain stuff to them, potentially give them quotes for an article they're working on.
That's awesome. Now we're coming up on time, but if you got a couple extra minutes, I'd love to keep asking you some questions. Are you good?
I am.
All right. So one of the other things I love about, and by the way, I should do like, Oprah here and say, you're not paying for this interview, like with the Meghan Markle, Prince Harry interview. You're not paying for this interview and no questions are off the table or whatever. So anyway, you've got a lot of incredibly helpful resources. One is a page I bookmark. It's like dog-eared in my browser because it's got over 60 topic ideas for releases. So that's killer free information. Just go in there. But I want to ask you, Mickie, based on your decades of experience, out of those 60, what are the top 3 or 5 just most popular releases that just continue to be successful regardless and just keep going, year after year?
I think anything with numbers and statistics,
Okay.
especially surveys and studies.
Yeah.
We have a few clients who all they do is produce surveys and studies, and they get picked up all the time because the media loves it. And they're very smart about putting a few questions in the survey that are thought-provoking or not necessarily controversial, though it can be, but tantalizing. And
Okay.
so the journalists love to build articles where it's like, you won't believe 47% of people in your industry do this.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, what's that? And so, that's a headline that's written for the readers, not, you wouldn't use that same headline for the journalist. But those type of things work really well. And they always have, and I think they'll continue to work well. Sometimes people get really like, oh, I don't know how I do a study or survey because I don't have enough people. There's lots of trade associations. The real estate trade associations, there's over 10,000 of them. And there are a lot of local and very specific ones. And they would love to be aligned with you. And they may only have 1,200 members or something like that. But I guarantee you that more than half of them will probably respond to a trade association survey. And they'll send it out for free. And then you can partner with them and send a press release talking about the results of that survey or study. So numbers work really well. And, even if it's just a top 10 list or a ranking or something like that, it doesn't have to necessarily be a survey or study, but numbers are great and they work well. I think that, going back to do an audit in your industry and determining what people aren't talking about and, introducing a topic that allows you to basically be that person who broke that topic to the media, sort of like that carpet company did in New Jersey. Other things that you can do is, I forget, there's people who just ride the coattails of whatever's breaking news.
Like the newsjacking.
Newsjacking. That
Yes,
was the word I couldn't think. And I was like, oh.
Well, I'm glad I watched one of your videos recently, so thank you for reminding me of that.
Right. It's one of those things that's right there on the tip of your tongue. But the whole concept of newsjacking is, when Target had the big data breach, credit card breach, every company that was involved in security in some way and consultancy was issuing their opinion about it. The good thing is some of them get picked up. The bad news is there's usually a lot of competition. So for that to work, you have to be first. If you're the first person, they're just going to grab the quickest and easiest quote. So if you can be very responsive and get out there almost immediately, that works and that can work well. And the other thing is there a way you can bridge that to something a little bit different? So now the conversation is similar, but it's deeper. It's something like the Target breach happened. Is it possible that most small businesses with a credit card terminal next to their cash register are vulnerable of creating millions of dollars of losses for them? Something like that. It's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. If you're a small business owner, you're like, I don't know. Let me read more about that. So those work really well. So the things that don't work well, new hires.
Yeah,
you got a new hire at the company. Everybody feels obligated to send those out, especially if it's an executive or something like that. And generally, they might get a very small mention, a little tiny thing in the trade publication. Yeah. It's like, on the move.
Yeah.
Bob Jenkins of Company A is now with Company B, and that's it. And people like that. So, for some people, that's all they want. But I feel like if you're going to send something over the newswire, which is not inexpensive, you want to work with really good material, have your best ammo and get that out there and sort of try to launch it, because you can take one press release and potentially get hundreds of media pickup, real earned media pickup, if you're strategic enough. And
right.
That's the ultimate goal.
Some other tired topics that are hopefully, been shot like the horse and put in the grave out back, or, new services added or whatever. And then my favorite, new website launched, or which is like, for a while years ago, that was a thing, but it isn't anymore. So people, stop doing the press release about your stupid new website, unless again, it's a big website with something new, incredible bells and whistles or whatever. If Amazon redesigns their site, of course that's press release. If Mickie or I do it, nobody cares, right?
Right.
Well, let me ask you a couple other questions. One that intrigues me is there have been a number of attempts, it seems like, over the years to modernize that standard press release format that we talked about. For example, Brian Solis was famous back in 2006. I remember this, for sort of coming up with this newfangled press release approach that was supposed to be more web friendly. This was even before Web 2.0 with, hey, put the RSS feeds on it and blah, blah, blah. But, how have services like eReleases helped, tweak or modernize and enhance that basic press release format over the years?
Well, the format has evolved. When we first started sending releases, including a logo was a $2,500 charge.
Jeez.
It was more expensive to include a logo than it was to send the release over the newswire.
Oh, okay.
And now we can do images at no cost. You can embed them on websites, but they upcharge that, which I don't recommend. So it is transitioning. They're now doing embedded YouTube links and stuff like that. So it's beginning to be accommodating of multimedia and the fact that people are getting their content in different ways. I do still think that at the end of the day, most journalists are working with writing and words. So I think having it in a text format will always be necessary. I don't necessarily see the video taking the place of the content, because the journalists want, at the end of the day, make it their own. So they'll turn it into an article, they'll rewrite it. The AP sometimes will use a release and just modify it slightly, but the way that they work is through licensing. So they have to modify it in order to control the content.
Got it.
But yeah, I mean, it is evolving. I think that being accepting of different things like Twitter links and other kinds of things is important. But there also doesn't really seem to be a want with the industry to go to one specific format, like a Word doc X type format of this is the way the future of the press release is, because PR Newswire is going to do what they're going to do, Business Wire is going to do what they're going to do, and they're only going to cooperate to an extent.
Yeah. That's great to know. Just two more questions and then we'll wrap up, because I could talk for this subject for hours, and have appreciated getting to know you on this call. Since again, I am a paying customer in the past of eReleases, and I'm a big fan of it. And by the way, so before I used eReleases, I had used everybody else. You mentioned PR Newswire, Business Wire. There was a bunch of them. And I don't remember why, but I was intrigued with your sales pitch, but I realized that you were going to use PR Newswire, which is your partner. I'm thinking, why won't I just go direct to PR Newswire? But I worked with you guys, and I did find some benefit to that, because again, it was not the big giant, which is now owned by Cision.
Right.
But what prompted you? What was your decision to go with PR Newswire and stick with them all these years? What's the benefits of PR Newswire and the eReleases marriage, if you will?
Right. So we always used to do it with our own database of journalists, and then PR Newswire reached out to us at one point and said, why don't you issue the releases through us? And I said, okay, that sounds great. And at the time, they said, we can give you a 15% discount. A national press release was around $800. And I said, well, my people can't afford that. At the time, I was charging $199 to just email to my journalist in my database and choose the appropriate industries. And so we went back and forth. They looked at the volume of releases my clients do, which is on average 3 or 4 a year. And they said, our salespeople are never going to reach out to these small business owners. They're not doing enough volume to make it worthwhile, and they'll never pay $800 for a national release. So we came up with a custom national distribution, which is very similar to the national distribution they have, but it's different enough that I can't say that I offer US one national distribution. It's a custom national distribution. And our prices start at the new customer special of $199, and it does go up from there, but it's nowhere near $1,000 because they're now
Right.
charging $1,000 to issue a release nationally. So I always say we act as sort of a co-op for small businesses, and because we have such a large customer base, we're issuing about 15,000 releases a year. We're able to negotiate a substantial discount with the Newswire and get a national distribution for customers who could never afford it otherwise.
That's great to know. And again, I found it super affordable, and especially as a PR person who's trying to make some kind of markup possibly on top of it. And
Sure.
there's always that to consider. I know you've got a lot of blog posts about should you even hire a PR firm. And you know what? People can knock themselves out. If you can learn how to write a good press release and pay Mickie directly, go for it. But there will be a learning curve. And again, some people just don't have the time or inclination to think like that, write like that, want to do that work. If not, you can pay Mickie to do one, or you can pay me to do one, whomever. But the point is like we're going to think like a journalist, and we're going to help educate you how to do that as well. This has been a great conversation, Mickie. Again, I could keep going for a long time, but I'll just direct people to where can they learn more about you and eReleases.
eReleases.com is my website. If you go to eReleases.com/plan, I put together a video training that talks about the strategy of press releases. And like I said, I think that's more important than writing a press release. If I was going to spend any time on how to write a release, I would learn the strategy first and then just look at a press release that's out there. Go to prnewswire.com and you can just look at a press release and say, oh, that's the style. That's what a headline looks like. That's basically it. But the strategy is the most important thing. And that video training I have, which is free, basically walks you through how to take a look at you, your industry, and come up with some strategic ideas to test in a PR campaign.
Yeah, and you wrote a book as well. What was that called? Because I got a copy of it.
It's the Beginner's Guide to Powerful Press Releases. It's on Amazon, but if you go to my website, towards the bottom, there's a way to get the book, a PDF version of it for free.
Yeah, that was a great read. The funny thing about that, Mickie, is this: I got that maybe a couple years ago, and like I said, I've been doing this since the '80s. And my wife comes in the room, she's like, "Why are you reading a book about beginner PR?" I'm like, "You can never know enough." It's just like the Zen master or whatever. Like, hey, I'm always a student, right? Because again, the format's simple, but writing a press release and connecting with journalists, and it's really having the empathy and the intellect, like you said, to go through the strategic exercise of what is going to resonate ultimately. So it's a fascinating game that you're playing, and helping your companies win at. So thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that people will get a lot of value out of this and go check out eReleases.
Thank you.